Good evening again, everyone, and welcome to this evening's program. I'm Jim Van Epps, the president of the Savannah Council on World Affairs, and the host for this evening's program, presented by Caitlin Welsh, the director of the Global Food and Water Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Ms. Welsh will be speaking on Russia, Ukraine, and global food security, and I will hand it off to Ambassador Larry Silverman to do the introduction and so forth. But before we begin, our sponsors for tonight are Kreitz Auto Group, and you'll hear me say this every month because they are a platinum sponsor, and they provide automotive excellence in Savannah and across the coastal empire. They've been doing that for over 80 years, and we're grateful to Kreitz for continuing as a platinum sponsor of the Savannah Council. We also appreciate our in-kind sponsor, the World Affairs Council of America, an independent, nonpartisan organization. It's our capstone organization. I don't report to anybody, but they provide support to this council, the Savannah Council, as well as 90 others throughout the country. And we really appreciate the support that they provide us. I'd like to also introduce a couple people. First is Alan Beals, who is the former director, the former head of the League of Cities. And Alan is right here in front, so I'd like to introduce him. Alan? And he's just joined us, and we're very happy to have you here. Understand you live very close. That's good. Also, I'd like to introduce Mark Friday, who's the manager of Planters Inn. You've heard me say in the past we have mentioned and highlighted Planters Inn as a sponsor of the Savannah Council, and we're very appreciative. In fact, they're engaged with us every month. So, Mark, I don't see you, but I know you're here. There he is, way in the back, waving his hand. So, Mark, thank you for being here tonight. So, Before I pass the podium to retired Ambassador Larry Silverman, I'd like to highlight and who will introduce Caitlin Welsh. As I said, I'd like to show you our lineup of programs for March, April, and May. Now recall that we sent out a survey over a year ago, and we asked what topics are you interested in? And we have focused our speakers on exactly the results that we've gotten. So when you see the results up there or who the speakers are, it's because that's what we've heard from the collective membership. And as usual, we got about a third response, but we got a sense of what the membership is interested in. If you look at May 23rd, not to slight the other two speakers, but Kurt Volker, the former U.S. ambassador to NATO, who's going to speak on NATO and U.S. relations. I think these are three that are really worth attending, and I'm excited to see. So, having said that, let me pass the podium to Ambassador Larry Silverman.
Thanks very much, Jim. It's a real pleasure. Thank you all for coming out, including the students that came out tonight. I do want to just mention one thing to echo, Jim, about our next speaker in March, on March 21st, Kristen Wood. We're trying to bring you speakers that not only deal with particular regions of the world, geographic regions of the world that you might be interested in, but problems or issues that affect U.S. foreign policy and America's relations with foreign countries in a global sense. And you're getting a great one here tonight in food and water security. On March 21st, we'll be getting at an issue that you don't get to read about, I think, or hear about very much, which is the use of what we call open source data or unclassified intelligence in a way. There's a lot of information out there, you know it from satellites, from various websites that, for example, track the yachts that belong to the Russian oligarchs, or track every single plane via its tail number in the world on a 24/7 basis. and of course satellites. And so there's a huge amount of non-classified information, which are actually very important to people making decisions in governments around the world. So we're going to have Kristen Wood, who is a former member of the intelligence community, now affiliated with the Belfer Center at Harvard University, to talk to you about this very new area and what we can make of it, what the U.S. government, how the U.S. government should use it. So tonight, it is a great pleasure for me to introduce Caitlin Welsh, who's the director of Global Food and Water Security Program at one of really the premier think tanks in Washington, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Caitlin worked in the State Department for 7.5 years. She's also was a longtime official at the National Security Council, where she helped form U.S. economic relations with the Group of 7 and the Group of 20 countries, and has really become one of the authoritative voices on global food security and water security in Washington. She's cited regularly by U.S. and foreign publications, electronic and print. And by the way, let me take an opportunity, because I just got to listen to her the other day on a podcast called The President's Inbox. Some of you may have heard of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is in Washington, D.C. and in New York, very prestigious organization. Full disclosure, I belong to it. That's the less prestigious part of that organization. But they do something called the President's Inbox on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, the top issues on affecting U.S. foreign policy. And Caitlin was on it not too long ago about this subject that she's going to be talking about tonight, which is global food security, but particularly the impact of the availability and cost of food around the world as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think I put in the advertisement that you would be hearing about this literally on the same day that the Center for Strategic and International Studies was publishing her latest work and report, her and her staff, that they put together. But that won't come out until next week, so you all are getting the scoop this week before it comes. So, you know, those people in that small town in Washington can hear about it after we here in Savannah. So without further ado, it's a great pleasure. Please welcome Caitlin Welsh.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Silverman, and thanks to everybody here for inviting me to speak with you tonight. It's a real treat to get outside the Beltway and to talk about what it is that I think about and write about to an outside the Beltway audience. I am not from the D.C. area myself. I'm from pretty far away in the Great Lakes, and so I get to do this with my family and friends back home. But I love chances that I have to do this with communities in other parts of the country. So thanks again for having me. And also I've been asked, is this my first time to Savannah? It is not my first time to Savannah. It is my second time to Savannah. My first time was only for a 2 or 3 hour trip. I was passing through here in college on my way back from the South back to where I was going to college in Virginia, and it happened to be on the night of St. Patrick's Day. We were here for 2 or 3 hours. It was a memorable, fantastic 2 to 3 hours, and then we got back on the road. But my family really loves Savannah. We have close family friends who've gone to SCAD, and so I have a lot of affection for the town and for the area. So I'm just happy to be here tonight. And when I was asked what topic I'd like to speak about, based on the work that I've done for a little while, I, of course, would have suggested Russia, Ukraine, and global food security. But then when we landed on this date, there was no other option, because tonight, I think of tonight as the anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion 2 years ago. It was actually February 24th, but it was a Thursday night, and we woke up on a Friday morning knowing what had happened in Ukraine just within the past 12 hours. So really, to me, it's the Thursday night and the Friday morning of this week that is the anniversary. So again, on the 24th, we'll be marking the actual two-year anniversary, but really it's tonight and tomorrow morning is the way that I think about it, because it was a Thursday night and Friday morning. And so I'm thinking about that right now. As Ambassador Silverman mentioned, we are putting out some analysis next week on this. In fact, we're looking at it from 3 different angles. Well, through a food security perspective, we're looking at it from 3 different angles, so we're putting out 3 different pieces. Actually, 1 was published this week, 2 will be published Monday, Tuesday, and then I'll be recording another podcast on all of this on Tuesday, so you can listen to a summary of all of this on the CSIS main podcast next week. But I'll be happy to give a preview of what it is that I'll be writing about in these pieces and what we're going to be publishing next week, which is actually something that I've been wanting to write about for 2 years, and I'm really, really happy that we're finally pushing some of this information out there. But so why it is that I care a lot about this topic? Of course, it was a huge moment in global politics. It meant a lot for me personally, and I look back at that time. My own son was 5.5 months old, and I can remember watching the news and seeing families that had decided to stay and families that had decided to leave, and seeing families with young children and thinking, what would I do if I were in that case as a mother of a 5.5-month-old in that situation? And anyway, I just recall having a very, very visceral reaction to what I was seeing on the news. And then, of course, being the director of a global food and water security program at a national security think tank, it's exactly why my program exists, is to give analysis and shed light on what was happening in real time, and give analysis that would inform the news, that would inform policymakers. And so we ended up investing a lot of our time and a lot of our resources in this topic from the get-go. So starting in, really it was February 2 years ago, we put out a really short piece on what would happen if Russia were to invade Ukraine, what the effects would be on global agriculture markets and global food security. But we had our names out there before this happened. And then once it happened and there was just so much attention to this issue, we did become a resource for media, which was great. But also we were able to use our platform to get the, so it wasn't just folks talking to me. I was able to use our platform to get the message out about how this invasion would affect global agriculture markets. And so 2 weeks after the invasion, I hosted an event at CSIS with the second in charge at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, one of the global experts on global agriculture markets who's at a main food security think tank. And our third panelist was a deputy minister of agriculture from Ukraine who had joined our panel by Zoom from an undisclosed location to speak with us to help get the message out to the world about what was happening in Ukraine, what the farmers there were seeing, and how the war was already affecting their operations. So I was very glad to be able to use our capacities to get this message out about what we were seeing. But anyway, backing up a little bit, as Ambassador Silverman said, I spent a long time in the U.S. government. I was at the Department of State for 7.5 years, and then at the National Security Council for about 1.5 years. And then before the State Department, I was a Peace Corps volunteer. I was at a small agency called the U.S. African Development Foundation. And I looked at food security for a really long time in most of the places that I was in the U.S. government. At the State Department, I was in the Office of Global Food Security. And most of the time, food security, when the U.S. government talked about food security, what that was code for was food insecurity in populations in low and middle income countries. So if you were talking about food security, you were necessarily talking about food insecure populations in developing countries. And that's real, and that's very important, and that's the focus of much of our all of our development policy, I would say. But to me, food security is a topic that's much more vast than that has much broader implications. And so coming to CSIS, where, again, I'm at a national security think tank and have the capability to define this issue more broadly, I'm able, that's essentially one of the things that I want to do is shed light on all the many different ways that food insecurity is important to global economic growth, to U.S. economic growth, to U.S. national security. And I've tried to do that since I started at CSIS. So the first long-term research project I did, for example, was on food insecurity in the U.S. military. So not just among U.S. veterans, but among active duty military members and their families. So looking at that challenge and looking at and proposing solutions to that. And then when it comes to Russia's war in Ukraine, looking not only at the way that food insecurity around the world increased, the way malnutrition around the world increased as a result of Russia's war, but what this means in the context of the war more broadly. So how is it that Russia is capitalizing on its destruction to Ukraine's agriculture sector and capitalizing on food insecurity that's increasing around the world to Russia's own benefit in this greater war context. And so that to me is a really important aspect of this that's pretty unexplored elsewhere. Yes, there's a lot of focus on how Russia's war has disrupted global agriculture markets and caused food insecurity to rise, but not as much attention on how Russia is using this to its own benefit in this war. And so that's what I want to talk about. And the preview that I'll give of something that I've wanted to put out for a while is being able to quantify how Russia is benefiting. So, and I'll get to this at the very end, but when we look at the countries that had been reliant on Ukraine and Russia for their grain imports, looking at how it is that these countries are less reliant on Ukraine and more reliant on Russia, and being able to put numbers behind that, which has been hard to do. I've wanted to do it for a long time, but hard to do because data is slow to come by. It's slow to come out. There's a lot of I'll get into the data challenges, but I'm happy to finally 2 years in be able to put some numbers behind this. So that's where I'll end, but I'll just start with what's happened since Russia invaded, and then what's happening right now, what continues to happen with global agriculture markets. And what we've seen since the beginning is that agriculture, Ukraine's agriculture sector, has been a major front in Russia's offensive since before the war started. So before they even invaded Ukraine, they were patrolling the Black Sea, and shipments of Ukrainian grain halted a week before Russia invaded. As soon as Russia invaded, you were seeing attacks across all aspects of Ukraine's agriculture infrastructure, fields, farms, warehouses, processing facilities, their agriculture export infrastructure, so roads, railway bridges, port infrastructure, et cetera. And I won't forget a piece of news that I read pretty early on where it was a farmer somewhere far outside of Kyiv whose farm had been attacked. And this farmer reported, this is said to the reporter, we thought when we were being attacked that they were just missing their target because we were so far outside of Kyiv or whatever the biggest city close by was. And the farmer said, we thought that they were way off target, but then we realized that we were the target, that this is exactly what Russia wanted to be doing. And so we at CSIS pretty early on did some of our own satellite imagery analysis of just mainly Russia's destruction to different aspects of Ukraine's agriculture infrastructure. We were very careful to note when we weren't sure if it was Russia or Ukraine that had destroyed, because sometimes Ukraine itself would bomb, let's say, a railway bridge because it was being used by Russia to transport munitions. So we were very careful in our analysis, but we were putting out imagery of the way that Russia was attacking Ukraine's agriculture infrastructure. And what we're seeing today is that agricultural land usage across Ukraine is down. Their production and exports are down, and this is having an aggregate impact on Ukraine's agricultural economy. It's a major source of Ukraine's GDP. Before the war, agriculture made up about 10% of Ukraine's GDP, 40% of its export revenue, 10% of GDP. The latest numbers we have from the World Bank are that Ukraine's GDP contracted by 29% from before the war until from 21 to 2022. So its GDP contracted, but the contribution of agriculture to its GDP contracted by even more than that. So the GDP is smaller, and agriculture is contributing even less to that GDP. What happened globally? So this is what was happening within Ukraine. Around the world, you saw the effects of disruptions in global agriculture markets. So Ukraine's exports were down. Also disruptions in global energy markets and global fertilizer markets. Immediately after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, world food prices hit an all-time high right after the end of February. After the end of March, they hit a second all-time high. So the highest level of global food prices, as marked by the UN Food Price Index, was in March of 2022. Around the world, and that's because the price of food, so the food prices reached an all-time high. And then you saw food insecurity around the world peak as a result of that, because food prices were higher. When energy prices are high, that pushes food prices even higher. and then fertilizers being implicated in this conflict as well, that meant that for countries that wanted to insulate themselves from the impacts of these shocks on global markets, if they wanted to insulate themselves by producing more food domestically, well, the price of fertilizer was a limiting factor, so they were less able to ramp up production domestically because of that. And there's a report put out every year by the Food Insecurity, FSIN, Food Security Information Network, and they reported that for the years of publication of this report, the highest number of people experiencing high levels of acute food insecurity was reported in 2022. We don't yet have the numbers for 2023 to know if it went up or down, but regardless, the highest numbers in the history of this report was in 2022. And at the same time that the number of people experiencing high levels of acute food insecurity were peaking, the cost of providing assistance to address acute food insecurity was also soaring, because imagine for an organization like the UN World Food Program, the cost of procuring food, that soars. And in fact, the WFP had procured a lot of its wheat from Ukraine, so it was less able to do that after the invasion. So the cost of buying food increases. The cost of fuel is higher, so the cost of all of your operations, if you're an organization like WFP, the cost of all of your operations increases. And then if you give cash-based assistance to populations so that they can purchase food locally, well, their own food prices are increasing, so the cost of cash-based assistance is also going to increase. So for a lot of reasons, the cost of humanitarian assistance delivery was soaring at the same time that the number of people who are experiencing acute food insecurity was also soaring. And in fact, today, World Food Program's monthly operational cost is still, I believe, $28 million higher per month than it was pre-invasion. And then, so that's what we were seeing in 2022. And then the UN is predicting that these impacts are going to be long-lasting. They look to all the way out to 2030 and are predicting that even by 2030, we're going to have many millions more people who are still experiencing chronic undernourishment because of the long-term effects of Russia's invasion. So they put the number at 23 million higher in 2030 than it would be otherwise. So we're seeing long-term impacts of this. Also, I like to, 2 points about nutrition also. I think we can often think that the food and access to food that's affected most by this war is food that's exported from the Black Sea, mainly staple foods, so wheat, corn, soybeans, sunflower products. But in fact, it's consumption not only of those staple foods that's affected, but consumption of all foods that's affected. Because imagine if you're in a country like Egypt that is heavily reliant on the Black Sea for its wheat imports. In fact, Egypt is the world's top wheat importer, as many of you probably know. So the cost of wheat increases. If you're a low-income household in a country like Egypt, when bread prices increase, the family will have, and the household income doesn't increase, the family will spend more money to access the staple food, to access bread, and they'll have less money left over to access more nutritious foods, so the vegetables, the fruits, the animal protein, dairy, etc. And in fact, the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, did a really good analysis within the first year of the war, looking at consumption of more nutritious foods in Egypt, and found that low-income households, in fact, were consuming less beef, less chicken, etc., because the price of these staple foods, especially bread, because that had increased. So it's not just consumption of wheat, bread, sunflower oil, etc., not just consumption of that that's affected, but also consumption of other nutritious foods. And then I've gotten the question, how long will these effects last? And in some places, the global market shocks subsided, and you see markets aren't as affected. I mean, Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a contributing factor to at least in the last 4 decades, highs in food price inflation in the United States, but food price inflation is falling here. But for some populations, the effects could last generations, and what I mean by that is if you were in a population experiencing high levels of acute food insecurity at this time, and were less able or unable to access the life-saving nutrition assistance that you needed, especially for certain populations. So especially for women who are pregnant, and especially for newborns and children up to the age of 2, not having access to adequate nutrition in that really short window can have lifelong effects on physical and cognitive development. So in that sense, the effects of this invasion could last generations, could last a lifetime or even generations. And I recall speaking with the head of UNICEF's operations in East and Southern Africa at the end of 2022, and she was talking about how the region that she was covering, so Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, and countries north and south of there, but experiencing historic successive droughts, extreme flooding, extremes in temperature and weather, and really extreme levels of malnutrition among the populations that she was working with. And she said that because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it took political attention away from the populations that she was serving, and assistance there was delayed by months. And I just had to think about the populations there, that there's some people that can't wait months. So for that reason, I think that there are ways to think about the effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine as lasting not just for a few years, but rather for lifetimes or even longer. So that's in a nutshell the what, what was happening, and for numbers behind all this, we've put out a lot of material and stuff. So we can put numbers behind things like Ukraine's lost production. In fact, looking at production exports of corn and wheat, as of the latest numbers, they're down by 11% and 15%. So it's pretty big still for a major global exporter. But in essence, so that's the what. But to me, again, based at a national security think tank, a really important question is, why is Russia doing this? And the way that I summarize this is that, in essence, Russia is experiencing nearly all upside from what it's doing, and any downside that Russia is experiencing, it's able to manage, and I'll explain that. But so the way that I explain the why Russia is doing this is that it benefits in a number of ways. It benefits from destruction to Ukraine's economy. So by targeting Ukraine's agriculture sector, it's targeting, again, a main source of Ukraine's economic growth. And as Ukraine loses revenue, well, that's only in Russia's benefit as it's waging its war in Ukraine. So wheat exports are down 11%, corn exports down 15%. Big economic contraction. So of course that's a benefit for Russia. Also, as Ukraine is exporting less, Ukraine's influence globally is contracting. So Russia benefits in both of those respects. And I think that's probably the main reason that Russia made as a main target Ukraine's agriculture sector. And in fact, I was mentioning just within the past hour or so that among the ways that Russia has targeted Ukraine's agriculture sector, it's not just by bombing all of the aspects of infrastructure that I mentioned, but it's also a huge landmine campaign that they have a system that's actually the Russian word for agriculture. So it's landmines that are a landmine campaign that is designed for Ukraine's agriculture system for farmland, essentially. And this summer, Ukraine became the most mined country in the world. So I'm happy to talk about. I'm not happy, but I can talk about that later on. But again, I think that that's one of the main reasons that Russia has made Ukraine's agriculture sector a major target and waged widespread and very intentional attacks sector-wide. Another benefit to Russia is the disruptions in trade within the EU. So what happened when Ukraine was less able to export out of its Black Sea ports, again, because Russia had been for all the reasons that we know that Ukraine isn't exporting out of the Black Sea. In order to continue to export after Russia's invasion, one of the ways that Ukraine did this was through its neighbors, through the neighboring countries, through neighboring EU countries. And what happened was there was a huge push and a very sudden push of Ukraine's grains through these neighboring countries. And at first, the EU, at least by what I was reading, it was a very welcome help that was being given by EU countries. They called them solidarity lanes. And so in solidarity with Ukraine, these countries were allowing Ukraine to export their grains by railroad, by roads, and in some cases by barges through these countries. But what ultimately happened was that the transportation system was not set up to transport that volume of Ukrainian grain through Ukraine's European neighbors, and so you had huge gluts of Ukrainian grain in these countries. And so because of that, because supplies of grain soared in these countries, the prices of grains in these countries fell, and so farmers in those countries started protesting. They said, we can't get as much money for what we're producing because we're handling so much more of Ukraine's product. And because the transportation system wasn't set up to export it, it just happened that Ukraine's grains just sat there in country. And in fact, the agriculture minister of Bulgaria said that instead of export corridors, our countries are becoming warehouses. And what you've seen play out over the last 2 years is that these countries put in place restrictions against import of Ukrainian grain. Of course, the EU didn't like that because that's against the EU Common Agriculture Policy. So then the EU ended up approving some restrictions on transport of Ukrainian grain. Those expired in September. The countries put in place their own restrictions again. Ukraine filed complaints at the WTO against these countries. There were harsh words traded at the UN General Assembly in New York this past fall. This ended up being an issue that was salient in national elections in a lot of these countries, where farmers in these countries really wanted their leaders to be representing them against essentially against Ukrainian grain. And then today, finally, I mean, it's an evolving story, but the EU once again approved some ability of these countries to limit in some way the transport of Ukrainian grain, but these countries didn't like what the EU approved, and so that's why you're seeing, for example, in Poland, a blockade. As of this week, they're putting up blockades at the border with Ukraine. They're getting Ukrainian grain and they're dumping it. And so all this to say that it's a main source of tension within the EU, which is how to both support Ukraine's agriculture sector, a big source of its economy, but not at the expense of EU countries. And so it's causing disunity, and it's testing unified European support for Ukraine right now, which also is, of course, in Russia's benefit, because this takes away, it takes resources, EU resources that could otherwise be directed at Ukraine. It takes away attention. And so I see all of the trade disruptions that have resulted from Ukraine having to push so much of its grain through Europe as being another benefit to Russia. So Russia benefits from the downturn in Ukraine's economy because of the destruction that it's causing. Russia benefits from the trade disruptions within the EU, which are testing and fracturing, in some cases, unified European support for Ukraine. And then one thing that I think is very, very important to note is the way that Russia is benefiting from food insecurity that it's contributing to in low and middle income countries. So again, because of these agriculture market disruptions that resulted from grain export restrictions out of Ukraine that resulted in disruptions in the fertilizer market and energy markets, you're seeing higher levels of food insecurity and higher food prices in many low and middle income countries, many of them in Africa. And Russia, for a period of time, did step in and help Ukraine to export some of its, well, I don't mean help, it at least stopped blocking those exports. And that was from July 2022 to July 2023 under something called the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Happy to talk a little bit more about that in depth later on, but that was in place for 12 months. And under that, essentially, ships were able to come into Ukrainian ports, load up with grains, and leave. And it didn't enable Ukraine to export what it had been exporting before the war, but they got pretty close. And Ukraine was able to export it was almost 33 million metric tons to 75 countries around the world. So it came in at an important time for Ukraine's ag sector, and it was very helpful until in July Russia backed out of the deal, and then Ukraine could no longer export out of those ports and had to look to other ways, including through these European countries. But in any case, food insecure countries like countries in Africa were affected by the initial disruptions brought on by Russia's invasion. They benefited when during the term of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and then when Russia backed out of that and terminated that deal again, these countries objected, of course, because they wanted Ukraine to continue to be exporting its grains. But what we've found is that yes, countries are opposing what Russia is doing. They opposed Russia when Russia invaded Ukraine, and they expressed their strong opinions when Russia backed out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative in July. But what Russia is doing is using its own agricultural exports to appease these countries. So Ukraine, of course, is a major agricultural exporter. Russia has been a major exporter of wheat, growing throughout this century. Russia became the world's top wheat exporter in 2017. Russia is predicted to export what should be a record amount of wheat this coming agricultural season, 2023-2024, a record for Russia and likely a record for any country around the world. So Russia has benefited from good growing conditions this year, but of course Russia didn't experience the same effects that Ukraine did. So Russia's ag exports are really, really growing. And what we're seeing is that Russia is appeasing these countries that are that would be upset by these disruptions through offers of free and low cost grain. In July of last year, right after Russia backed out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, there was a summit in St. Petersburg between President Putin and lots of African leaders. And at that summit, President Putin pledged to send free grain to 6 African countries. Just so happened that those African countries were ones that had either voted against UN resolutions condemning Russia or had abstained, but regardless, Russia chose those countries carefully. And then a month later, Russia announced a deal to send 1 million metric tons of low-cost grain to the neediest countries in Africa through another side deal. So Russia is, it hears this opposition from other countries. It's using offers of free and low-cost grain to keep these countries quiet, essentially. And what so what I've wanted to do is to be able to put numbers behind this, because I really wanted to be able to see what are those countries that had been, let's say they had been more reliant on Ukraine for grain, but because Ukraine is exporting less, now they're importing more from Russia, and therefore Russia has more influence. And so I really wanted essentially a crystal ball so I could see this precise trade data per country so I could know where is it that Russia is having the most influence. And so that's a question that I've had because I was predicting that this would happen. And just side note to a conversation that I had 2 years ago or so, completely separately, with someone who calculates numbers on global food insecurity with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. So I was having a conversation with him about how we actually calculate these numbers. And I asked him a question. I said, if you could have a magic wand, and if you could know something about global food insecurity, what is it that you would know that's difficult to find out? And he said, if I had a magic wand, I wouldn't find out any specific numbers. If I had a magic wand, I would use it to educate people about the fact that there are some things that we just can't know, that we can only estimate and can't really know. And which I thought was a beautiful but frustrating answer. And so when it comes to this question that I had, where I was like, I just want to know what are these countries that Russia is more able to manipulate because it's capitalizing from food insecurity that it itself has caused. So that's essentially what I'm finding, is that it's really hard to find these answers. Why? Because, conveniently, right after Russia invaded Ukraine, Russia stopped reporting its trade data internationally. So you have to use other creative methods to find where it is that Russia is sending its exports to. But that's what we're publishing on Tuesday, is an analysis of the best data available about where it is that Ukraine's exports have fallen and where it is that Russia's exports have increased. And so just a couple of things that I think are noteworthy are that, so as I had mentioned, Ukraine is pushing so much more of its exports through its European neighbors. And in fact, the level of Ukraine's exports that had gone that are going to Europe, it increased from before the invasion, 2% of Ukraine's exports were going through European neighbors. Since then, 50%. So a vast increase in Ukraine's exports, which is why we're seeing these trade disputes emerging within the EU right now. Something else that I think is really interesting about the way that Ukraine's exports have fallen and how its markets have changed is that before Russia's invasion and then during the period when Ukraine was still able to export under the Black Sea Grain Initiative, a major beneficiary was China. So of all of the grains that Ukraine had shipped out of the Black Sea in those 12 months from July 2022 to July 2023, nearly a quarter of those grains went to China. Most of that was maize or corn. Most of that goes as a source of animal feed to produce animal protein, incredibly important source of food for the Chinese population. Ukraine was Ukraine was a very important source of this commodity for China. At the same time that Russia also was wanting to keep China close, and I saw that China's reliance on Ukraine for maize was keeping those countries close as well. And in fact, China made some statements publicly last summer trying to encourage Russia not to back out of this deal. When Russia backed out of this deal, they condemned Russia's decision. They held meetings, high-level meetings between Chinese officials and high-level officials in Ukraine's Ministry of Agriculture, still pledging to maintain trade there. So it was very interesting to me to see how ag trade was keeping Ukraine and China close at the same time that Russia was wanting to keep China close. And so I saw that as a counterweight to what Russia was doing. Since then, though, since this summer, China is not, Ukrainian exports aren't as easy for China to access, and so China has shifted to South America actually as its main supplier of maize or corn. And so I think that's just a dynamic to watch because, again, Ukraine had some important influence in China through this that it since has lost. So those are just a couple comments on what we're seeing in patterns in Ukraine's exports. When we look at Russia's exports, though, as I mentioned, Russia benefited from some favorable weather, a really good growing season. Its exports year over year keep increasing to the point, again, it's 51 million metric tons that Russia is expected to export this coming year. Record for Russia, record for any country around the world. Russia's exports are increasing to every region. And in fact, what we saw when we looked at this data that I was finally happy to be able to look at is that Russia's exports were increasing to across sub-Saharan Africa to every sub-region of sub-Saharan Africa. So East Africa, Central Africa, West Africa, and Southern Africa, Russia is increasing its exports over the past 2 years. So the trade data is telling us that at the same time that we're hearing that from Russia itself, where, again, their pledges of free grain to 6 African countries, pledged to move 1 million metric tons to the neediest countries. Beyond that, it really is ramping up its exports to African countries, I think in large part to keep these countries on board, or at least quell their opposition to Russia. And then also, we looked at fertilizer exports from Russia. Russia had really has claimed from the beginning that its own agriculture sector is being harmed so much by sanctions that are imposed by the West. They claim this, and there's a slight grain of truth to that, but the greater truth is that sanctions exempt all of Russian agriculture exports, so there really isn't that much to Russia's argument there. And then when we looked at Russia's fertilizer export data, their export of all fertilizer types fell for the first part of 2022, had already rebounded by the end of 2022, increased by even more in 2023. And so for most types of fertilizer, Russia's exports have rebounded. And in fact, even for the period of time when Russia's exports of fertilizer were down at the beginning of 2022, because fertilizer prices had spiked because of this war, its revenue had increased by 70%. So Russia was even benefiting when it was exporting less because prices were so much higher. There's a sub-story, which is that the one type of fertilizer Russia cannot export right now is one that it ships through Ukraine out of a port near Odessa, and it's unable to do that. It's been unable to do that since it invaded Ukraine, and so the exports of that type of fertilizer are down. So all of this to say, we knew from early on that Russia, clearly from seeing the news, from analyzing our own satellite imagery, that Russia was targeting Ukraine's agriculture sector very deliberately, widespread attacks, intentional attacks across all aspects of Ukraine's agriculture sector. And then, early on too, we were hearing things like former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev said that food is our silent weapon. It's our quiet but menacing weapon. So we knew that Russia was thinking about food and the way that it could also use it in other ways in the context of this war. And then this summer, President Putin was even more blunt. He said that Russia can fully replace Ukrainian grain with the grain that we're exporting. We just want to eliminate Ukraine on the market, and we can make up for that fully with what we're exporting. So we've known that this has been a weapon in Russia's toolbox since it invaded Ukraine. And so again, finally, we're able to put some numbers behind that, behind how it is that Russia's market share is increasing and where it's increasing, and thereby where its political influence is increasing through what we're publishing next week. And I think that again, is a really important aspect of this story. A lot of the coverage of the way that Russia's invasion of Ukraine relates to food security has to do with how food insecurity has increased, how malnutrition has increased in a lot of countries around the world, which is very real and very, very important. But I think a really important aspect of the story is how it is that Russia is capitalizing on that and manipulating countries through the food insecurity that Russia itself is causing. So that's what we try to call attention to that. And what I try to do is actually make sure that our policymakers are aware of this when they're crafting policy having to do with our own food security programming. I want to make sure they have this information. And then I guess I just want to end not with this negative story about how it is that Russia is using this. I mean, we're in this piece that I'm putting out, we're calling this the greatest increase in food insecurity due to military reasons in modern history. We really have never seen an increase in food insecurity globally for a reason relating to a war in modern history. But yeah, again, I don't want to end there. So what can we do about this? And so I think that obviously incredibly important to addressing the effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on Ukraine's agriculture sector and on global food security is through military support for Ukraine. Because without military support for Ukraine, any efforts to rebuild Ukraine's agriculture sector will be for naught if Ukraine cannot defend itself. But beyond that, I hope that our policymakers will also consider increased support for Ukraine's agriculture sector. When we look at all of the support that the U.S. government has given to Ukraine over the past 2 years, very small fraction. I mean, you can count the support for Ukraine's agriculture sector in the hundreds of millions. There's an initiative out of USAID that I think that they've put a total of $250 million behind. The State Department is a major funder of demining, including on Ukraine's farmland to the tune of, I think, about $90 million. So it's in the probably less than 500 million is what I'm able to count. I think that there's a lot of room for the U.S. government. I hope once the U.S. government, once Congress approves increased support for military for Ukraine's defense capabilities, I think there's a lot of room to support Ukraine's agriculture sector, which again will be to Ukraine's benefit economically in this war, but also it's for global benefit. When Ukraine exports more, it's better for global markets, better for global food security, and Russia will have less to capitalize on if Ukraine is exporting more and if countries are more food insecure, therefore. So I talk really quickly. I know I do. So I just talked for a while. I talk quickly, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks very much, Caitlin. And we'll now go to questions and answers. Please raise your hand, and I'll come to you with the microphone. You don't have to identify yourself.
Thank you very much for that. That was really terrific. I appreciate it. So I have two questions for you. The first is there were widespread reports that Russia was confiscating grain out of the Ukraine, and then in turn exporting it under false flags
Yeah.
to some of those countries in North Africa that you were mentioning. Yeah, so that's the first question, and the question really is how do you quantify the amount of grain that they were confiscating and so Putin is saying we can do away with Ukraine and but how much of that is really Ukraine's grain? That's the first question. Second question that I have for you is what role, why did Erdogan play the role that he played in the Black Sea Initiative, right? So
Yeah. Great. So it was stolen grain. The last number that I saw, and there might be more recent numbers than this, but the intelligence community declassified a report this summer where they put the number at 6 million metric tons of grains that that Russia had stolen from Ukrainian territory, and then rebranded and resold. That's an important story, and I think that that's very headline grabbing. But I think that that's far lower than what it is that Ukraine has not been able to produce or export otherwise. So that's not the main source. That's not the main reason that Ukraine's production exports is down. It's just one very nefarious aspect of what it is that Russia is doing. And I recall actually seeing some reporting that the State Department was telling countries, food importing countries, not to buy these shipments from Russia. And I thought to myself, like, well then what are you offering? I hope that the State Department was offering an alternative. I don't think you were there at the time, but but anyway, I think it's simply to tell a country, beware of this and don't purchase this food because it was stolen from Ukraine, and it's that to me that's not a solution, because these countries they're going to need food from any source, even if it's stolen and sold by Russia. But anyway, that's the latest number that I saw, and then why it was that Turkey played that role. I think. I'd be curious to hear what a Ukrainian would say about this, because when I've talked with colleagues in the Ukrainian embassy, for example, they're very they're negative about the role that Turkey has played, probably for commercial reasons, because they probably wanted to continue to see commerce through the Bosphorus Strait. That has to be one of the main reasons.
I actually have sort of an answer to that. So most of this grain was actually processed in Turkey, and then Turkey was able to add so much added value price tag on it.
That's interesting, yeah, because Turkey is a main destination of Ukrainian exports, so that too. Thanks.
They benefited, like the number on that benefits humans.
Yeah. But then that doesn't answer why it is that Turkey entered in an agreement with Russia and Qatar to export Russian grain to the neediest African countries. So I think that Turkey wants to play both sides, both the Russian and the Ukrainian side. So I was surprised that as soon as Russia backed out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative in July, and Turkey did condemn that, President Erdogan did condemn that decision, then Turkey turned around and entered into this agreement again with Russia and Qatar to say, okay, well now, so sorry for Ukraine that you can't export. Now we're going to help Russia export your own products to African countries. So again, I think that Turkey's trying to play both sides.
I would add that it's a fairly regular occurrence that President Erdogan wants to try to insert Turkey and himself, into the middle of these things to show the value of Turkey and his government to international partners. Let me go. I'm going to go back and forth from side to side. I warn you. So.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation, and I really liked your suggestions of supporting the Ukraine militarily and helping with their agriculture. But what about Russia? Would you recommend any direct action against Russia, sanctions or other actions that are going to keep them from benefiting from the agricultural side?
So, would I? In early 2022, I really would have recommended that. And in fact, I was looking at what it was that Russia was doing and how it was causing food insecurity and benefiting from food insecurity in African countries, especially through its own exports, and really I was perceiving this dynamic and really wanted to stop this from happening. So I drafted a piece that proposed all these different ways to curtail Russian exports and incentivize countries to import from Ukraine instead of Russia and all these things. And one of my very close collaborators had been chief economist at USDA and an ag negotiator at USTR and on the Council of Economic Advisors, and had been working on these things for actually decades more than me. And he's just like, we can't do any of these things. I mean, this thing that you're proposing would be against WTO obligations. This would be market distorting. This would be da-da-da-da-da-da. So all of the market distorting ways that I wanted to put into writing to suggest to curtail Russia's exports really wouldn't have been good for global markets. But the one thing that I think is beneficial is helping Ukraine's agriculture sector and helping bring more production online and more exports online, because they're both exporting out of the Black Sea, and the more exports coming from Ukraine, well, the more you have an option to counter an alternative to Russia's exports. So to me, that's the one place where we're really in the clear that there are, very clear benefits are investing in Ukraine's agriculture sector. And I think it's very wise from the U.S. side and the EU and other countries that put sanctions on Russia, that all countries have had carve-outs for all agricultural products, for the reason that they knew that if there were any sanctions on any aspects of Russia's agriculture markets, then they would have very immediate and very negative effects on food security, mainly in low and middle income countries. So they really wanted to avoid that.
So you talked about the bottleneck in Europe. Is there no way to relieve that?
So I think that there's no immediate way to relieve that.
Of course not.
Yeah.
There's got to be, is anybody trying to do anything?
Yes, and I think regularly. I think that there are efforts to improve that. For example, there were reports pretty early on about how the Ukraine rail gauges didn't match the rail gauges from EU countries, and so there were efforts to make it so that it was much easier, so that you don't have to stop, take loads off, put it on another train. Efforts to make that faster, but again, that's on an entirely different timeline than an agricultural production and export timeline. So yeah, there are efforts to improve transportation there. But the reality is, and we talk to anybody who's been involved in Ukrainian agriculture for a long time, that the entire agriculture infrastructure, the entire system is set up to produce and export very quickly out of the Black Sea. And in fact, it's one place where it's a very, very relatively short time and space between production and export. If you think about the United States, we're in our main ag-producing states, we have to export all the way down the Mississippi River, Gulf of Mexico, in Brazil, all the way. Transport routes in other countries are very, very long and costly. The benefit of Ukraine is that those routes are very short. So I think that ultimately anybody in Ukraine will say, we just need to have access to the Black Sea ports. That's the ultimate solution. So they're reluctant to do any long-term solutions through European countries, even though they are making some efforts to facilitate export there.
Thank you, Caitlin, for your presentation. So I have two questions. The first is kind of specific. The second's a little bit meandering and some meta, so I apologize if it's not clear. The specific one is, do you see the Black Grain Sea Initiative as a success of multilateralism in a time of conflict, or just kind of a happy contingency where, everyone's sort of interests came together, including Russia's, in the sense it didn't thwart their kind of agrarian geopolitics that they were pursuing? Because, I've kind of I have mixed feelings about, whether that was a true multilateral success, and you can read it both ways. I'm curious how you see it.
Yeah.
My second question is, as someone who writes for a national security-focused think tank, your job is to kind of take these proximate, pressing events as they occur and sort of think about them in terms of, national interests and their immediate implications. Whereas if you think about something like food insecurity, this has been a slow burn, especially over the last 10, 15 years. And so the factors that you cite that were exacerbated by the invasion, things like rising food prices, which are making it more difficult for people in middle and lower income countries to feed themselves, that had been increasing, right? And sort of, that trend wasn't that disrupted necessarily by the Ukraine invasion, in part because of the EGSI success. The World Food Program has had tremendous trouble sourcing enough grain, right, for areas in the Sahel and Sudan, Yemen, places like that, which was of course made worse. But that trend was also very present. And then you have this kind of structural dependence within the global food system, right, where any shock, like a drought or something like that, kind of impacts the ability of these populations to feed themselves. And so, like, is it difficult to separate in your analysis, like the immediate impact versus the slow burning trajectories that have been present?
Yeah. Great questions, and I don't mind the specific or the meandering meta ones. But on the specific one, I like that question about do I consider the Black Sea Grain Initiative a success? And I even would get that question from reporters who would call and say, "Is this working?" And I would tell them it's working against the terms that were set up for this specific initiative, but it's not working to bring Ukraine to its pre-war levels of exports. I think that there was this idea that the Black Sea Grain Initiative just let Ukraine export as it had been doing pre-war, when in reality it was just 3 of the many ports that it had been using on the Black Sea, so only 3 were operational. And yes, Ukraine could export about 33 million metric tons to 75 countries, but this was still lower than it would have done otherwise. So it was good to keep the ag economy afloat there, but it wasn't set up to bring it to pre-war levels of exports. And in a sense, I do consider it a success of multilateralism, especially during active wartime, that over 1,000 ships were able to be inspected, go in, load up with grain, re-inspected, and out to the rest of the world. What that masks, though, is that Russia was still able to manipulate this even while it was ongoing. So I mentioned that the one fertilizer type that Russia couldn't export was the one that was exported through a pipeline through Ukraine out of a port near Odessa. The exact port that pipeline travels through, when that pipeline was attacked in June of this year, Russia stopped the inspection of ships into and out of that exact port. So in essence, assuming that it was Ukraine that attacked that pipeline and made it so that Russia really wouldn't be able to export fertilizer through that, Russia, in retribution for that, or in retaliation rather, they said, because you bombed this pipeline, we're not going to let you to export or ship anything out of this. So that was while it was still active. They blocked exports out of one of the ports. So Russia was still able to be manipulative even while it was in place. And then the other thing that I think is really important is something that I'm observing recently, which is that so after the Black Sea Initiative was terminated, Ukraine announced this humanitarian corridor. So it's in essence Ukraine saying, okay, even though Russia backed out of this initiative and they made the Black Sea unsafe to travel in once again, they announced this humanitarian corridor. So in essence, it's just some ports in Ukraine that Ukraine exports from, and when they export, they hug the coastline of Romania and Bulgaria very, very closely, and then out through the Bosphorus Strait again. And so they're able to get ships out that way, and it relies on essentially Russia's decision not to attack those ships. Ukraine has had a lot of naval successes recently, so Ukraine is able to defend itself there. But what we've seen is that in December of this year, the monthly exports from Ukraine surpassed any amount of monthly exports under the Black Sea Grain Initiative. So in December, it was 4.8 million metric tons. Any amount that they achieved under the Black Sea Grain Initiative was the peak was about 4 million metric tons. So I think it's very interesting that it's outside of this multilateral agreement, outside of this UN agreement, that Ukraine has actually been able to export more. And in fact, Ukrainian farmers were saying that they actually prefer exporting now than under the Black Sea Grain Initiative, because there's no long inspection times, there's no long shipping times or anything like that. So I actually think that's pretty interesting. So I don't really have a yes or no answer to whether it's a success or not, because again, if you're seeing that they're exporting more now and farmers are happier, those are important data points. And I don't know. It was very important. If anybody wants to learn more about the Black Sea Grain Initiative, there's very transparent data that's made available by the UN, and it was a very serious effort. And the fact that we talk about it in the past tense is just wow, I can't believe we achieved it, and then I can't believe it went away so quickly. And I just hope that Ukraine's exports achieve good levels once more. I didn't answer your second question, but
You've been talking about Ukrainian and Russian wheat, corn, et cetera. In terms of global food security, what role does the United States and Canada, who are big producers of wheat and corn, what role do they play?
Number of ways I'll answer that question. But looking back in the immediate aftermath of Russia's invasion, when you saw lower amounts of these staple foods on markets, there was a push in the United States to make up for that shortfall. So members of Congress are saying, why can't we ramp up our production really quickly, and just why can't we capitalize on the fact that Ukraine's exporting less, we have a lot of land here, we should be able to do this. And the answer was that it's not something you can do very quickly. You can't, production takes time, it takes many, many months, but even preparing, some members of Congress had proposed taking land out of conservation programs to plant and grow and export from there. Again, that takes a really, really long time. But also the high cost of fertilizer was affecting our own decisions about producing and exporting. And so in the wake of Russia's invasion, you saw record low amounts of wheat being planted here in the United States and record high amounts of soybeans being planted, because wheat uses more fertilizer, so soybeans use less fertilizer. So anyway, our own production, it's not easy or an easier quick solution for the United States to make up for that shortfall, and even the United States was being affected by disruptions in global fertilizer markets. That said, of course, the United States is a major producer and exporter, important to stabilize, keeping global ag markets stable, and then we're the top donor by far to the UN World Food Program. It might be that in the last year, the United States alone provided more than half of the budget to the UN World Food Program or something like that, but we are far and away the highest donor there, in addition to most other forms of food security assistance, so huge role to play there as well. But hope that answered some of your question.
I can save Larry some steps.
I'm breaking down. Gordon has a strong enough voice, he doesn't need this.
I'm amazed that the production's not down more. How in the world do the farmers operate in a wartime? That's amazing to me.
Yeah, I have to say that I've had the same impression recently, where I look at these numbers and the area planted is, and we'll put these numbers out, you can see them next week, but the area that's planted is down by a lot. Amount that's being produced is down by, again, 11 to 15%, which is a lot for a major exporter. But again, the fact that it's a hot war and that Russia has deliberately attacked all aspects of Ukraine's agricultural infrastructure, I too am impressed, and I think that it's in large part due to the determination of Ukrainian producers.
But also a lot of domestic demand is down.
Within Ukraine?
Because a lot of people have immigrated. They left the country, so you don't have to provide for as much domestic demand, and also so many territories are not even within that scope anymore.
But I've had the same impression as you, that you would expect it to be down even for, and it is down substantially. But again, I think that what they've been able to do is due to, and also in talking to folks that I've talked to there, due in large part to determination. And I mean, you even see farmers anyway dealing with things like landmines on their farms and making difficult decisions about their own production and continuing to do it. And anyway,
One last question
Sure.
here.
I'm wondering, to your knowledge, does the contracts that Russia has with the African nations, are they short-term or are there any long-term?
yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. But you do make me think about an anecdote that something that I heard. I was talking with the head of one of the UN food agencies in fall of 2022 after the UN General Assembly meetings, and this person said that they had met with a number of African leaders up at UNGA, that's what we call it, and that all those leaders were saying that food security is national security. That they kept saying, like, this is a national security issue. So we need assistance for food security in our countries. And the way that I think about that is when I hear that a country that is import dependent and has high levels of food insecurity says, when a leader says that food security is a national security issue, the way that I hear that is that leader is saying food security is an issue of my own security, my job security, because these leaders know that if food insecurity rises, that their hold on power is threatened. And so whether it's a short-term or a long-term agreement with Russia, a leader will do whatever is necessary to get the necessary food supplies to keep prices low in that country, knowing that, again, when food prices spike, this can lead to unrest and riots, and it can threaten someone's hold on power. So I don't know if they're short or long term, but regardless, they're important and they're a source of political influence.
Just 2 quick points before we thank Caitlin for a great presentation and frank answers to our questions. One editorial comment, which is this kind of use of food as a weapon against Ukraine is only, to me, and I'm speaking on my own behalf, another reason for why continuing U.S. assistance to Ukraine is so important at this time. One other thing, totally off of this subject, but I just wanted to mention, many of you were in this room when Deputy National Security Advisor and Ambassador James Jeffrey spoke to the group, and just in the realm of keeping you up to date, because we're trying to bring you people that are in the news, making news, commenting, educating our decision makers, as Caitlin does. Jim sent me, Ambassador Jeffrey sent me a report that or an article that he's recently written for the Wilson Center in Washington, where he works on the Gaza crisis, only part of Iran's regional menace. So some of you might want to read that, whether you agree or disagree, but we are trying to bring you people here who remain in the news. So Caitlin, thank you very, very much for coming here.
Thank you. Thanks for having, and thanks for your great questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thanks.
So one last comment again. Thank you, Caitlin. And if I find there are the dates. So we hope to see you back here on the 21st of March. I'm afraid to tip my head. I've heard so much, learned so much tonight. If I tip my head, I'm going to lose some of it. So I got to get home quick. So thank you. Thank you all for coming too.